Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my little corner of YouTube. We have a book video today. It's been a while since we've done one of these, and this is one of the books I've been really excited for this year. We have Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White. This came out at the start of September, comes in at 360 pages for the UK Daphne Press edition. And this is a YA horror. As always, we shall talk about the story, characters, world building, and presentation before I give you my final thoughts on it at the end. So let's dive straight in. This story follows Miles Abernathy. So Miles is first off described as a transgender autistic communist. All these things come into play for numerous reasons, as we will get into a little bit throughout the course of this review. And the story starts with Miles sending off an email to their parents to say, I'm transgender and my name is now Miles. And then going off to a party with some photos that they have acquired. These photos are evidence that the Sheriff Davies, was involved with and caused an accident that caused one death and caused an injury as well to Miles' dad. And so you've got proof of some corruption going on here, and they go in and they show their best friend Cooper. Now, this is important because for 100 years there has been a blood feud between the Abernathy family, which is Miles' family, and the Davies family. This goes back to when this was a booming mining town, and Saint Abernathy, Miles' descendant, was very much kind of the revolutionary rabble rouser, trying to get better work and conditions for the miners, who ended up being partially massacred because of corporate interests. Shocking to hear that, innit? Unfortunately, after leaving this party, Miles gets followed by the sheriff's son and two of his friends and beaten to within an inch of his life, wakes up in hospital with only vague memories. And this is where the sheriff first appears to basically go, you don't remember anything, do you? And you have this first projection of personal and political power as a threat. And that is a reoccurring theme through here. The idea of abuse of power against those who are less fortunate or do not have the means to defend themselves. This comes up multiple times. During their recovery, obviously, Miles goes to their job to find out they've been laid off. And on the way out, they discover that the person who's replaced them is one of the people who was involved in battering them. Absolutely losing the temper. There's a bit of a pushing and shoving goes on, and you have an accidental blow to the head that leads to one of his assailants dying. Obviously, this affects Miles badly. Miles goes and speaks to their friend Cooper. And over the course of time, it basically becomes well, why just stop there? Why stop with one of them? This will never end unless we end it, sort of thing. Cooper is another who has been off at the bad side of the sheriff in the past, or whose family has, I should say, and has not fared well. So you have this then cycle of violence that starts to accelerate away. Now, this is, again, a cycle of violence that's been going on for a century at this point. This is set in 2017, just after Trump won the general election, the presidential election, I should say, in the US. So you very much have a distrust of authority going on here. You very much have a priority of corporate interests as well over personal interests and personal lives. So the other themes you see here is the lack of resources for those in need, different standards of living, different, not codes of living, double standards in terms of how some people are dealt with, abuse of power, bullying, all that sort of stuff. Now, the other thing you have here is this is a coming out story, as Miles, right at the start, has sent their family an email to say that they're transgender, and you're also dealing with the issues of that as well. This is a YA horror. It is very, very dark. It's quite politically charged as well. There's a lot of commentary in here on corporate America and the abuses of power that have happened, and the dangers are that certain people face following Trump's presidential campaign. Please don't vote him back in. The rest of the world doesn't want you to vote him back in unless you're Russia. Please don't. Only political bit I'm saying in here. But it explores these themes really well, and these themes of cyclic violence between groups and how it only ever reinforces the position of those in authority, and it's very much a punching down mechanic. Really well done. It's a very strong story. I did think this was going to be a historical story, though, just based on the cover art and the misread of the blurb that I did. And whilst there are a couple of bits that aren't quite flashbacks, but you do have like this apparition that appears, which is never made entirely clear if it's just because of the injuries that Miles sustained or if there's actually something there, which I actually quite like. But you also have the historical records and documents that are covered as well. And it is overall really strongly told and well paced as well, especially in the back half as things begin to accelerate away from the main characters. So speaking of characters, Miles is the focus of this. I'm going to get to them last, however. A lot of the supporting cast don't really get a huge amount of time. Sheriff Davies is very much this omnipresent threat, but there's not a great deal of personal development there. This is somebody that you can tell is drunk on their own power. They abuse it often, be that through soft or hard displays of that, be it open threats or manipulation. And there's plenty of evidence that this has been going on for a long time, and a lot of people have suffered from, the various things that have gone on. But other than that, he doesn't get a huge amount. He's very much almost the corporate stooge in many regards. He is the corrupt lawman. That piece down to his son, although his son feels a little bit, I don't want to say nastier, but more blunt in their nastiness. But safe for the knowledge that nothing will ever happen because they're the sheriff's son. You then have their two friends who are involved in battering Miles at the beginning. Very little time spent with them. You have a couple of moments where you almost feel sorry for one of them, but there's plenty of other stuff in here that shows that actually, maybe not. So there's a little bit of development there just to flesh them out, but you get very little time with either of them. The characters you get the most time with other than Miles, really, are Cooper and the parents. So Cooper is somebody whose dad has kind of gone off the rails over the years, has to keep an eye on him because of opiate abuse, because of things that have happened in the past, especially involving the sheriff. And they are quite close to Cooper, and they come across, to Miles. They come across almost like what I would call a Golden Labrador personality at the beginning. Very supportive, very friendly, pretty non-judgmental, takes everything in the stride, full of energy, but quite protective. Well, that begins to twist and turn as things begin to happen, as the first death occurs, and things begin to spiral, and that idea of it lighting this spirit of vengeance almost within, and that just whole disintegration of moral core. And I actually thought the character was going to end up at a very different place, and I wasn't sure how comfortable I was with that, but actually the way that the character's arc was wrapped up made sense for the story in terms of the perpetual violence and the cycles of violence and retribution and revenge and vengeance and how they just feed each other. So that was really well done. The biggest story with the parents of Miles is the fact that they're dealing with the fact that their daughter has just said that they're now called Miles and that they're transgender and that they're a boy. From what I can tell, this is the first communication that there's been, and they both take it differently. So first off, we need to establish that the dad ran for sheriff a few years earlier and was involved in a mystery accident, which was caused by the sheriff. so that he could keep the job, and has suffered from mental health and some physical issues as well since then, including opiate abuse as well. The mother is very much a hard-working, doing as many jobs as she can to just keep the roof over their heads, keep the bills being paid as best they can. But the reactions to this email are both very, very different. Whilst the dad is overall generally quite supportive and non-judgmental, and whilst does have a few trip-ups, you get the sense of somebody who, I love you regardless. The mother doesn't. The mother is certainly not supportive. It's hard to tell whether accepting, especially early on. There's very much a sense of, well, if you want to be called Miles, you can tell the rest of the family because I'm not doing it, sort of attitude there. And then a refusal to refer to them as Miles throughout a large part of the book, so a lot of dead namings going on. It's quite difficult and actually quite jarring for the character of Miles as well as they're working through. Now, Miles is defined by three things. The first one is the relationship with their parents in terms of coming out as being transgender. The second one is the blood feud and how that affects their friendship with Cooper and a number of other characters, as well as the issues with the sheriff. Well, the third thing is the fact that they have these political views which definitely do not mesh with the sheriff, and when they end up meeting up with some old friends from school that had moved away and moved back that turn out to, first of all, be transgender, autistic, and they open a communist bar in the middle of this rundown American town, which I just love, that has anarchist rock bands playing on the 4th of July and basically going, fuck the police, fuck the government. It's just spectacular to me. So you have this very left-leaning character who believes, understandably when you look at the history of the family as well, in the rights of workers, collectivism, has had this obsession with looking at various different things to do with union busting or Vietnam or the US tendency to be an oppressive regime against certain groups and stuff like that. And that is actually a fascinating way to approach this sort of character as a complete opposite of where the political spectrum sat at that time. Again, Trump had just been voted in. We know the disaster that ended up being and will end up being again if he gets back in. So there we go. Political point too. Well, the other thing is the fact that they're autistic. And the fascinating thing with this is that as a character, Miles doesn't realize, or at least doesn't consciously realize that they're autistic. So what do I mean by that? So there's a point in the book where Miles is speaking to one of their old friends who is autistic, who just goes, "You're autistic as fuck," to him. And it's like, Miles is really taken aback. It's like, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm just a bit different, that's all. And then goes home and does what everyone does and Googles everything. And there's, I think I can't remember the exact wording, so I'm going to paraphrase, but it's jarring to see your entire personality reflected back at you from a computer screen, because they see all these different things and it suddenly clicks, and it's this moment of, that's why I'm like I am. And this speaks to a few issues in the education system and the healthcare system, which is shown as being incredibly underfunded. There's the issues, obviously, with it being a private healthcare system as well. You've got a under-equipped hospital, so people can't get the medical care that they need. There's a lack of education. There's a lack of support groups. It's just a mess. So it makes sense for the character of Miles to not necessarily have clicked on this. But it is quite obvious as a reader that they are, because of a number of mannerisms or habits and the internal monologue that you have going throughout the entire book. Now, what I will say is that they were a very difficult character for me personally to read. When I read characters, I can normally find something to latch onto, but Miles' character and writing are so different to pretty much anything else that I've read. And in terms of their internal monologue, in terms of some of their habits, their coping habits, the way they analyze situations, and even the way they speak at times as well, that it was hard for me to properly latch, especially in the first half of the book. Now, oddly enough, once the moment of acceptance sort of bleeds in, where they realise they're autistic, it clicked. And I'm not quite sure why it clicked at that point. I think it's because you kind of have this feeling of somebody who's in some ways kind of at war with themselves and don't really know who they are, which again feeds into the idea of the transgender challenges that they're having at this moment in time and getting people to accept them for that, because that's a just beginning road, and various other things as well. But it's a very intense character to read. And there are some social and cultural differences here. You know, this is set in small town America, in Appalachia, which is a very different upbringing to what I have on the outskirts of one of the largest cities in the UK. I will say, though, that bizarrely, this blood feud that goes on almost feels like gangland warfare, but less shooty, which is amazing to say about the US, actually. Overall, I think Miles is a really engaging and compelling character, but very, very intense to read, so it's something to be aware of going in. Definitely took some brain turning on my part to try and grasp certain things. I do like the various different habits that are shown and the variations on a similar habit. So things like having their own shoelace and sort of chewing on it, or when they're anxious, sort of tying it in knots and then focusing on untying the knots. And inability to pick up certain social cues and the way they have to kind of be more actively engaging and analysing words and tone and stuff like that is really fascinating to read about, but wasn't especially easy. Onto world building, and world building is pretty good. It's clearly you have this juxtaposition of the political leanings at the time versus the political leanings of the main character, and also the main character's family in many regards as well. You have a strong commentary on the state of the US, especially in these rural towns, which are so underfunded, so desolate, for want of a better word. But the thing that really grabbed me with this is the sense of familial community, first of all, and the sense of pride in where that everyone felt of where they lived. And I don't want to say misplaced pride, because that's the wrong term, but the feeling I got for Twist Creek is it really reminded me, bizarrely though this sounds, of from Cars, Radiator Springs. This place that was at one time a bit of a boom town. You know, it would have been vibrant, it would have been busy, it had this great big theatre where people could go out, and it's just been abandoned. The businesses have moved out, and it's just been left to rot. And the people are still there, just forgotten about. No one knows about them anymore because this is a drive-by town. Nobody knows it's there anymore. There's no reason to stop here. You're just going straight past it on the freeway. But the people who live there, it's theirs, and they're proud of it. They're proud of their homes. They're proud of where they live. They're proud of each other and their family, and that sort of sense of pride. And that again is juxtaposed against the fact that, you know, some of these houses are falling apart. They're in bad repair. You've got garbage on the front porches. You have no services at all. You've got an abusive sheriff who no proper support, no real services. But it's ours, and we're proud of it. It reminded me a little bit of something from one of the Pratchett books, and I can't remember which one it was. I want to say it was from Guards, where Vimes was kind of talking about where he grew up in the shambles in the shades, and it was too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash, talking about the fact that they wouldn't whitewash the houses, but they couldn't afford to paint them, so they kind of made do. But it was still their homes, and was still, and the idea of you'd go into these places and they'd be really clean and really tidy and almost immaculate, and it gave again that sort of vibe, which is well done. But then you do have the world building around the fact that at this point in time, the theatre's been burned down because of what happened with the miners 100 years earlier, and it's been left there as this monument and reminder. So a monument to the massacre, a reminder to this is what you do when you stand up to authority. Remember this, the threat, which again links into the blood feud and the issue with Sheriff Davies in particular. Really well done. The other thing that is really cleverly done, this would probably come under presentation, I suppose, but I want to talk about it a bit here, is quite often when I read books, I kind of play the scenes out in my head, so characters get voices, but the accent of those voices, generally speaking, will fall into generic English. There's a few exceptions to this. There's a few books I've read that you can clearly hear the accent coming through in the text. This is a good example of that. There's certain verbal flourishes, certain little ticks in the speech, certain habits and mannerisms for all the characters that you get a sense of the accent of the place. So as you're reading it, if you're the sort of person who hears the words in your head like I do, you can hear the accent. It's not a generic accent. You can actually sort of put an accent to it, which is really well done as well. And the way that the different people talk to each other, or you have these moments of immense politeness, which then don't quite play off with the way they are with family, for instance, or friends. But they are with authority figures because you've got to be polite to the authority figures. Stuff like that is, again, really, really well done. So, yeah, I've not really got much else to say on that. It certainly helps that everything here feeds into the thematics of the story as well. Also worth mentioning actually, before I forget, this is the least gory of White's books so far. But there is gore in here. And the gore is, again, very squiffy, very, very well written. So, yeah, it does have a few moments that are really well done. So bear that in mind. But a lot less than what was in The Spirit Bears Its Teeth. Certainly a lot less than what was in Hell Followed With Us. Presentation then. First thing, once again, Andrew Joseph White is a very, very good writer. I need to get that off the bat. Gets good sense of tension, good control of plot threads. Everything wraps up in ways that make sense. It doesn't feel like there's any plot conveniences in any of the books that I've read so far by them, which I appreciate because it drives me around the bend. You have strong character work. Everything progresses in a way that makes sense and at a decent pace. You have variations in the pacing of the story, which makes sense as well. And the general story flow works really well, especially in the back half. One thing that did throw me, though, was chapter length, because it's more variable in here than I think I've seen in any other book. Chapter 1 is a page, right? Chapter 2 is 20 pages? Just under... No, sorry. No, it's not. I've skipped it somewhere. Chapter 2 is 10 pages. And you have a couple that are a little bit bigger than that. But then you have... Like, chapter 4 is literally like one line. One line of text. And generally speaking, I don't like short chapters. And it took me a bit of time for me to grasp what was happening here. It just didn't fit in my head. And what's happening is you have these moments of immense trauma or impact for the character. And then the next chapter, which is only going to be this soundbite, is the coping moment or the realization moment, which looks like a snapshot, a snapshot, a snapshot. And it catches the mentality of the character of Miles as they're trying to analyze what's going on manually rather than having it automatically work in the background like it does for someone who isn't neurodivergent. And it's actually quite a clever narrative trick because it forces you into that mindset of reading, because chapter breaks automatically make you stop and think for a second before you move on to the next one. Even with a page turner, it's a stop moment automatically. Most people who read books will stop their reading at the end of a chapter. So it's a really clever narrative device. I don't know how much I like it, but I can't say that it's not effective. Finally, the cover art. Like, this is beautiful. I mean, you can see the other two behind me. All three of the main books so far, the cover art has been absolutely spectacular. And to be fair, Peachtree, who is the main publisher of this over in the US, they are on fire with their covers, like especially their YA covers. They are absolutely spectacular. So the cover artwork was by Evangeline Gallagher at Peachtree, and the cover design was designed by Jane Tibbetts. And it does a good. It shows all the key points in there. The dog lady is important. The dog's fine. It's worth mentioning here, but you get the rural sense, and you've got like the blood staining, and you've got the railway spike, which is actually quite important as well as a symbolic thing, and it's really, really well done. So yeah, another good example of good writing. What I will say though is there are a few moments where the dialogue does feel a bit stilted. Now, I don't know if this is just because of the nature of the characters when they're having certain conversations, especially political ones. I don't know if it's just the way that politics is described and discussed in the US versus the UK, because it's a lot less polarized over here than it appears to be in the US. But at times it just felt slightly off, and it's the first time I've come across that in any of White's books. But that could just be a cultural difference, or as I already mentioned, I had a few months where I was struggling to read the character a little bit. It could be a little bit of that playing into it as well. Final thoughts then. I gave this one a 4.25 stars out of 5. This is still really, really good. It is probably my least favourite of White's books so far, and that is settings based. I prefer my fantasy, I prefer my dystopias, I prefer my more historical stuff as well. I'm not a massive fan of contemporary fiction as a rule of thumb. That being said, you have a really compelling character that's a really intense read, and they're intense all the way through as well. It's not like the situation of Benji within Hell Followed With Us, where you had these moments of lightness. The character is full throttle all the way through, and it can make it a tiring read and a really intense and pressurized read as well, which is both a good and a bad thing. The world is well realized, the plot makes sense. The ending as well, even though part of me would prefer a darker ending to this one, again, makes complete sense, and all the characters just work as intended, and it feels like the real world, which might be why I don't like it as much, because it's a bit too close to home. But overall, I think this is really good. It covers its themes very well, of the dangers of unchecked corporatism, unchecked power as well. That's something that's come up in multiple books as well. The importance of a supportive network, and what happens when that breaks down, and also when other people step in. Overall, a really good book and a good start to the month. But what I would like to know is, have you read this, or are you considering reading this, or any of Andrew Joseph White's other books? Let me know in the comments below. I'll catch you all very soon.